Morning, everybody. Happy hump day. Welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. Now, today we're trying something a bit new. There's so much going on in the world that it feels like we need to just sort of take a moment, have a bit more explanation of where we're headed. So today I'm joined for an in-depth discussion about Donald Trump and Ukraine by the Mirror's US editor, Chris Buckton, and our defense editor, Chris Hughes. Morning, guys.
Morning. How are you doing?
I find it very difficult switching between Chris's, but we'll get confused, but we'll try to get through it. Now, this is the People's Paper Review, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We will do our best to answer them for you. There's two Chris's here. If you want a specific one of them, you may need to indicate which one you're talking to. Those of you listening on podcasts will just have to ask yourselves how we're going to survive the next few years of Trump. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a totally different story today, an interview with the mum of one of the Southport stabbing victims on the same day that the Home Secretary is announcing new moves to combat knife crime. Inside the paper, there is a big spread about the Saudi Arabian summit that took place yesterday between Russia and America and what came out of it. And it's incredibly bizarre summit in a way, because the US was sitting down to talk with a Russian who is sanctioned by the US, right? Who's been persona non grata for a very long time. We'll get to how that all came about. There's so much to discuss and unpack here. I think we ought to try and sort of start chronologically. And for me, some of this feels like it started about a week ago with a prisoner swap that didn't really get much attention here in the UK. So there's an American middle school teacher called Mark Vogel who was released from a 14-year sentence in Russia on drug smuggling charges after he was found with 17 grams of marijuana in his suitcase. Now, on the same day, the US released a man called Alexander Vinnik, who had been accused of cybercrime, basically online money laundering with digital coins. He'd been held for a long time, but was facing up to 20 years in prison. The reason I want to start here is that it feels very uneven between these two. Vogel was carrying medical marijuana that had been legally prescribed for him in Maryland, although it wasn't legal in Russia. He was traveling through at the time. That's just stupidity on his part. Vinnik had pleaded guilty and admitted something that's very bad in every jurisdiction, and he hadn't even been sentenced yet. So, Chris Buckton, let's start with you first from the US perspective. Why did Trump agree to what seems like a very asymmetric swap? And he did greet Vogel on the tarmac with all the bells and whistles, didn't he?
Yeah, I think Trump craves an early political triumph, and anything to do with Russia and getting Russia beyond to the table to talk about things. I mean, let's put our cards on the table. Trump loves to make out he's this peacemaker. He craves a Nobel Prize, and they'll see this as a way of trying to open that door to Russia. And it has worked. There we go. They're already talking, aren't they? So, I think you're right. The deal was very lopsided in terms of the offences committed, or alleged to have been committed anyway. But he's offered a sacrifice, as it were, giving them a much more important Russian back and taking a middle-aged, middle-class school teacher back onto US shores for a charge that would probably never stick in the land, really.
Yeah, but he has played well back home. He's on the tarmac. He's greeting this guy back home. He's wrapped in a flag. The cameras are all there. Trump looks like the big deal maker. But now we sort of fast forward a bit, I suppose. So within 24 hours of that prisoner swap, Trump was on the phone to Putin, and it seems like the prisoner releases sort of greased the wheels a bit, and it meant these two men could finally talk. And they had this 90-minute call where afterwards we heard this very surprising news that the two of them had agreed their teams could hold talks about renewing friendly relations, about finding a peace deal for Ukraine, which Russia, of course, if anyone's been living under a rock, invaded in 2022, and the US has spent about $60 billion, £60 billion, I think, sending weapons to defend Ukraine. Although Europe has spent much more America sort of counts its $60 billion very carefully. So, Chris Hughes, then, was this not always on the cards? I mean, it shouldn't have been a surprise. Trump signaled during the election this was exactly what he would do. Were you surprised that this is what had actually happened?
Yes, I was, and I think the Ukrainians were too, Susie. In the run-up to let's talk about pre-election. The Ukrainians, the diplomatic sources that I was talking to were saying, look, don't assume anything about Trump that he's going to ditch Ukraine and then ditch NATO, which now looks possible. One particular guy who works at the embassy here was telling me what they were counting on is Trump's unpredictability, that Trump would use the fact that no one can predict what he's going to do next as part of some deal that would save Ukraine and perhaps leverage against Russia. That appears to have gone out of the window. There are kind of, MAGA supporters in Britain and the UK who are arguing that this is part of some sort of long-term, clever, sneaky playbook. I don't think it is. As I wrote this morning, I think that what you see is what you get. Trump telegraphed clearly what his intentions were before the election and in the first few days of his administration, and he's carried it out. What is deeply mystifying a lot of people is the swiftness of the swiftness of the releasing of evidence that he is actually fawning to Vladimir Putin so clearly and being so contemptuous of Vladimir Zelensky and and America's long-standing European allies. It is shocking, and it's taken people deeply by surprise. Now, I think Zelensky's reaction of, I don't care, I'm not going to Saudi Arabia, they didn't tell me anything, understandable petulance, but you have to wonder what he will do next. Now, the Ukrainians are, as we've seen evidentially over the last 3 years, you can't predict what they're going to do next either, because they are very, very resourceful. And as the financier Bill Browder, very, very anti-Putin, probably next down on Putin's list after Zelensky, said yesterday that, there is this 300 billion pounds of frozen Moscow/Putin assets that could be used to help Ukraine in the interim before we know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, so that's something else I dare say that the deal maker is going to be talking about at some point, is the assets that have been frozen, what it can be used for, whether it has to go back to Putin and so on. Richard says Trump seems to be badly advised and poorly read, yet he manages to make the largest conspiracies from wild and exploit them into his narrative. Europe states have 60% contribution. Trump shouts about, the money that he's put in, less than the money that everyone else has had. The first time round that Trump was in the White House, Chris, he had a lot of advisors around him who were telling him he couldn't do that sort of stuff. And it felt from here like there was a lot of parenting going on. And this time round, he's got rid of all those people. They have fell by the wayside or been fired, or, he's just lost them or doesn't want them anymore, whatever. And he's kind of been surrounding himself people that are more like enablers. Am I right to think that the White House now, that there aren't any grown-ups in the room, but it's more like Lord of the Flies?
When you look back to his first term in office, you had like Mike Milley, people like that, the military guys around him, very experienced guys who were ready to break on Trump and what he wanted to do and what he could do, what he couldn't do. Whereas now you're looking at guys like Pete Hesketh as the defense secretary, an ex Fox News reporter, whose confirmation was beyond the pale, really, when you look at his personal life, how he got in there. And then you look at JD Vance as well, who will just tell what Trump wants. Just coming to the point about Chris there, what Chris said there about, the Zelensky left on the sidelines. To me, it's a little bit like two burglars going into your house and deciding who's going to take the loot, and the homeowner stood in the garden thinking, what can I do about this? That's how serious this is. The fact that they're not at the table, I think, is astonishing. That two superpowers are now, arguing over who gets what. And you look at the Trump plan, the reported Trump plan, what he's going to get from this, it's just unfathomable. It's almost like American colonization of the Ukraine.
It's very surprising, everything that's been happening away. But like I say, we kind of knew it was coming, so it shouldn't have been a surprise. And yet when you actually see it, you go, wow, this is this is what it looks like. Rosie said he's a crazy, dangerous man. You could be talking about literally anybody here. I hope it's not one of the Chris and Rosie. What do you think, everybody? Do you think that this is a peace deal, and because it's peace, it therefore must be good? Or do you hold that, the Ukraine must have more help and support from this? And what I want to ask you, American Chris, is the reason, I suppose, that Trump is being so, as we've heard from the other Chris, is so disrespectful of Ukraine and Zelensky, so dismissive and belittling of them. Is that because he doesn't have those advisors around him telling him how we normally behave in these situations? Is it because it was a Biden era thing, the support for Zelensky, and he just wants to completely be the opposite of that? Or does he genuinely just have total disdain for someone who allows themselves, in quotes, to be victims of a bully?
I think it's a combination of quite a few of those. He'll do anything as well to book Biden's work and the work that Biden did. But equally, his ego is so great. I mean, you look at the talks on Greenland, for instance, the taking over of Canada, the talking over the Gaza Strip. I mean, and let's put our cards on the table. This is all about one thing. It's with Gaza, with the Ukraine. It's all about its resources, its minerals. You look at Gaza, the oil fields off Gaza. That's what this is about. Let's not kid ourselves. And the likes of Ukraine, I mean, 500 billion to tear them in for the rest of the days. It's just nonsensical. But you're right. No one is putting the brake on Trump in the White House, and there is nobody who can. That is the problem. And the fact that he's now got Congress, he's got the Senate as well. It's very, very difficult for anyone to hold him back. And certainly the relationship he has with Putin is more than worrying, I think, for Europe.
Yeah, it sounds like he's probably taking more advice from Putin than he is Congress anyway. So let's fast. I mean, Nuts and Bolts says Zelensky doesn't quite understand. These aren't peace negotiations. They are peace with IECE negotiations. I'll take this piece and you can have that piece. Yeah, I think you've probably got it right there. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to our own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Now, he joined France this week in being the first countries to offer to send peacekeeping troops to man the Ukraine border in the event that the war was over. There was an emergency summit between European leaders in Brussels, which broke up with very little change on anybody's side because Europe has not been invited to take part, so they didn't really know quite what they were doing. So Starmer's heading to the US next week. Chris, I imagine you might be knocking around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
He's going to be seeking, I assume, to sort of be a bridge between like this old world order where everything made sense and the new one where Trump and Putin and others like them can sort of act with impunity. How is the US reacting to Starmer and this talk about Europe being involved and maybe peacekeeping troops on the ground? And in fact, how are they reacting generally, the people of America? How are they reacting to this? Are they just liking what they see?
Well, the problem you have with a lot of America is that beyond their shorts, there is not much feeling. It's a very selfish attitude that many of them have, and if it doesn't affect them directly in their own backyards, and they're not really that bothered about it. You look at the vote and the election, how it went, and the biggest things were quite domestic issues. The whole Ukraine thing, all they see the Ukraine thing is that billions of dollars are going out of their taxpayer check and not coming back and not getting any return. And Trump's played into that, and he's campaigned on a way that what we're going to get back in return from this. We want the debt paid back. I don't think any other country has that view whatsoever, but it's emboldened a lot of his MAGA fans. And in their opinion, why are we involved in this at all?
Yeah, it's probably it's a long way away, and I can imagine if it moves to another EU state at some point, like Estonia, for example, they're going to go this where, and it's
I mean, you could ask the average American where Ukraine is, point to the Ukraine on a map, without being too disparaging. I would imagine that many of them couldn't even name where it was.
Some of them probably can't point to North Dakota on a map, Chris.
Yeah, and coming back to the Starmer chats, it's all right. You see historically with Trump that what he says in front of a leader at one point in the White House, in the Oval Office, or whatever, it's all very cordial. But away from that, as soon as that leader leaves, everything changes. Everything changes. So I mean, you've got to take Trump what he says with a pinch of salt, really, on much of what he says.
Yeah, some of what he says and what he's talking about, how they're not going to defend Ukraine at any point. It doesn't really tie up with some of the financial stuff that he wants out of it, but we'll get onto that. Now, what really matters, of course, is how Ukraine reacts. And I'd be very interested to know if there's any Ukrainians who are watching this. Get into comments. Let us know, how do you feel about what is happening, kind of without any say-so. It's very bizarre, the fact that you can talk about peace without talking to one of the parties in the war, and that you think that will actually lead to a lasting peace. Now, on Newsnight last night, the former Ukrainian Prime Minister, called, I think it is Arseniy Yatsenyuk, was on there, and he was less than happy. And he said, basically, hundreds of thousands killed and wounded, atrocities that the Russian army committed. What kind of concessions could Ukraine possibly give that they haven't already seized effectively from us? Now, Chris Hughes, you've been on the ground in Ukraine many times since the war began, and you've got excellent contacts there. And, there have been some astonishing atrocities. Ukrainians have not been totally innocent in some of them. There's definitely been war crimes on both sides, but the Russian debt in that regard is absolutely massive, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, in the opening days of the war, what we saw, let's focus. Well, so from 2014, they've been warring in the east post the Maidan Revolution, in which Kyiv lent towards fluffy liberal Western Europe. And then after the war broke out, very, very suddenly, you had an influx of extremely ill, poorly trained troops from places like Siberia and out in the middle of nowhere in Russia, poorly educated, north of Kyiv, in places like Bucha, where we visited shortly after they left, myself and a photographer, and it was the scale of it, dead bodies everywhere, and the amount of people who were just so deeply in shock and keen to talk to us about the things that they'd seen. Grown men weeping because they felt emasculated. There was nothing they could do. They hid whilst the members of their family were killed, and huge great pits where corpses were being dragged out that had been clearly abused of not only Ukrainian soldiers but civilians, old women, and then really tragically little bags, obviously, of children. Now, and these, by the way, were not pits that were dug by Russians to hide their crimes. Far worse, at gunpoint, Ukrainians were forced to bury their own at haste before taking cover again, because the Russians were so sick of the unpleasantness of having to deal with corpses in the street. So just that little kind of vignette in Bucha tells you everything you need to know, I think. And we can talk about the fact that, we can equivocate between what the Russians have done and what the Ukrainians have done. I think it pales when you look at what Russia did, and the amount, the hundreds of thousands of files of Russian alleged war crimes that lie in The Hague. So that hasn't even been mentioned, as far as I know, by Trump's negotiators. And those investigations will go on for possibly for decades, as we've seen with the various wars in the Balkans. And and then, Susie, as we mentioned before we started talking about this, the thousands of Ukrainian children who've been taken back into Russia for reprogramming, or whatever you want to call it, in a sanitized way. It's just inhuman. It's the inhumanity with which Trump is treating this, the lack of diplomacy, the inhumanity, the insensitivity towards international norms, the breaking of all the rules of diplomacy that have been developing and evolving for more than for hundreds of years. And you, as we've also sort of theorized, who knows what's going to happen? Even as we're talking, probably something's changed in this this sort of development.
Yeah, we're trying to give our viewers and listeners sort of an in-depth analysis and some understanding and a handle on what's going on, and it could be different by the time they get around to listening to us. But you've got a lot of contacts, I know, on the ground in Ukraine, and some of our viewers may think, well, they must be mightily relieved that there's any chance of peace. Surely they would welcome, even if there's a very high cost, even if there are many things still to sort out, like returning those kidnapped children or making reparations of any sort to anybody, they must still be glad at the idea of peace, are they?
I haven't spoken to anybody who believes a word of what's coming out from the mouths of Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister in Moscow, or Putin regarding any chance of peace. I don't believe, and nor does anyone else that I've spoken to in Ukraine or here, from the intelligence world, the military world, that you could accept any promise. This is going to sound terrible, but that you could accept any promise made by the Kremlin as regards peace. They may say, right, we'll take 20% of Ukraine and Crimea, draw up a line along the 700-mile frontier. But they've already said you're not going to have European troops there as peacekeeping forces. So how on earth does anyone think you're going to hold back Russia's desire for hegemony all over Eastern Europe if they say, yeah, we'll stay here, you stay there? Now don't forget that you're talking about the industrial heartland of Ukraine that they want. Well, does anyone seriously believe, I mean, especially in Ukraine, they don't believe that will be the end of it. You may get some brief reprieve of a few months or whatever, but it's going to come back. These wars have unless you resolve a war, unless someone wins the war and dominates it and decisively says the people that did this to us are going to leave and they've lost and they get toppled. We're talking about Putin here. That war will keep going and going and going, or will reappear elsewhere under a different name, or so nobody really believes it. No,
and you've got also that when you have the end of a war, you need to have that sense that everyone is accepted, whatever the result is. A bit like an election, you need to know that everyone goes, well, yes, they've won, and you're bad. You're a bad person. Now, Chris just said that God knows what secrets Trump's administration is sharing with Russia. Yesterday, we got to this situation where US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Russian foreign minister, who Chris just mentioned, Sergei Lavrov, they met in Saudi Arabia. And this was astonishing because Lavrov is still economically and diplomatically sanctioned by the US, yet they sat down to a chat in Saudi. They agreed after these talks to staff their embassies again in each other's countries, to send ambassadors back, having cut those diplomatic ties in 2022, and to begin some talks about a peace deal. But of course, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, is not at the table. Europe, which as a landmass has been invaded, was not at the table. And Chris Hughes, as you said in your analysis in the paper today, Trump has given away almost every bargaining chip before they've even begun to sit down and start talking. What hope is there, do you think, that any agreement these two come to would be of use, that Ukraine or Europe, I mean, we would know Putin may not abide by it, as you said, but would Ukraine or Europe stick with it if these two came up with something?
Right now, I think that this is my opinion and the opinion of some other people that I've spoken to, whatever deal they come up with, whatever suggestion for a deal they come up with, at the very best, it'll give us an insight into what Trump's really thinking and the relationship between him and Putin, which is interesting. And at best, it may serve as a beginning to peace talks, which bring in, hopefully, Zelensky and the rest of Europe, because it simply isn't true that the Americans have done the main work there. It's absolutely not true. Europe, as we said before, has provided more money and aid to Ukraine. And let's not forget that the rest of Europe has taken in 7 million refugees from Ukraine at some cost. Now, of course, Europe's happy to do that, but I think, as I say, whatever these two sides, who are excluding so many other people whose noses have been put out of joint, rightly so to think that, it's just that it can only be regarded as the beginning and not decisive. Otherwise, that war won't be resolved, in my view.
Yeah. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that Trump's peace deal is going to get somewhere? Where do you think Putin's going to go next with this? I mean, is there any way of knowing? The answer is probably somewhere absolutely bonkers no one was expecting, I thought. Now, overnight, there's been all sorts of things happening in the US, as there is every night, it would seem. Donald Trump gave a bromance interview with Elon Musk, who has also been tweeting that Zelensky's not interested in peace, only wants war and power, despite all the appearances that everyone has gathered over the last 3 years. And in a quite extraordinary press conference, even by Trump standards, the president stated that Ukraine started this. I can't play you a clip from it, but he's completely overlooked the atrocities and the fact there are kidnapped children still missing. So he said, I quote, "Today I heard, oh, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years ago. You should never have started it. You could have made a deal." Now, Chris Buckton, this is your wheelhouse. Did Trump just misspeak? Did he maybe mean you could have found peace a bit sooner? Does he genuinely believe that Ukraine was for some reason asking to be invaded?
No, none of those things. Trump is, what you see is what you get with Trump on the tin, and the way he's been so dismissive of Zelensky, not just now, previous when he was not in power, how he spoke about Ukraine and how derogatory he was regarding the deals that have been put in place to support them. You've got to bear in mind, it looks the way it's going, isn't it? It feels like Ukraine's been bullied for 3 years by Putin, and another bully's now going to come in and give them 3 more years of probably longer of hell. But no, I think Trump's laying the groundwork to try and make the best deal possible for the US out of this as far as he can, and that is by besmirching Zelensky at every opportunity he can. I mean, he called for an election, didn't he? I mean, how are they going to have an election saying that, he talks about how Zelensky rose to power, and then he wants this election. Well, hang about 20% of the country is occupied by Russia at the minute. As Chris said, 7 million people have fled the country. What type of electorate have you actually got in there? It's just, an election now. What would it create? It would create forced negotiations on Russian terms. The ceasefire would solidify Russian gains. It's just complete nonsense.
Yeah, and how can you have an election when 20% of your country, I think it is at the moment, is occupied by somebody else who's not very good at holding good elections? Let's face it. Now, I think we do have a bit of a clip from the press conference, so let's just play that now for our viewers.
Well, we have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, or essentially martial law in Ukraine, where the leader in Ukraine, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating, and where a country has been blown to smithereens. You got most of the cities are laying on their sides. The buildings are collapsed. It looks like a massive demolition site. So many of the cities. I mean, they haven't done it in Kiev because I guess they don't want to shoot too many rockets in there. They've done it 20%, but they haven't done it 100%. If they wanted to do it 100%, it would probably happen very quickly. But you have cities that are absolutely decimated. And yeah, I would say that, when they want a seat at the table, you could say the people wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, it's been a long time since we've had an election. That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries also.
Well, also, interestingly, there have been people sort of sharing overnight information, polling in the Ukraine saying, for example, 56% of Ukrainians don't want an election right now because there's just too much stuff going on, and it wouldn't be fair or reasonable. You wouldn't be able to count it properly. You wouldn't have the right people there because, like as Chris said, 7 million people have left, and there isn't any sort of happy way that anyone can get down to the ballot box in a lot of cases. But there's a bit of revisionism there, Chris Buckton, because he's talking about how Kyiv has only been hit, 20% of Kyiv has been hit by rockets, because sort of implying that Russia let them off. Now, I can remember, I'm sure, they tried to get to Kyiv in 2022 and embarrassingly failed to do it. And that's why they sort of were left sort of making a mess of the east of Ukraine. They couldn't get to Kyiv. They couldn't do it. And Kyiv has been shooting down Russian missiles with drones and doing quite well. That's what I don't understand. That Trump, I can understand him thinking this is a small country and a smaller world leader in terms of his importance and value, who's been treated like he's a bigger guy than he is, and we can just override them a bit and we can find a way to get to peace and everything else. But to kind of just completely revise history to say, well, you started it and the only reason Kyiv hasn't got hit is because of Russian kindness. I know that Trump's got this thing where he just kind of rewrites history all the time, but is that actually working in the US? Do they actually hear that kind of stuff, like that press conference at Mar-a-Lago, and go, well, yeah, fair enough?
Yeah, half the country does. Half the country does believe that. And this is probably why he's back in power. You're right, he does revise history time and time again, and has done not since he came into power, but long before he came, as a businessman, he just rides roughshod over of what the world has seen. But I think, as I say, he has emboldened so many people in the US that simply buy in to whatever he says, drinking the Kool-Aid, as they say in America. And it's very difficult to turn that ship around in terms of what Americans think. There's the Democrat side of it are very aware. I mean, you drive around the streets of certain pockets of the US and you'll see the Ukrainian flag still being shown in the window. But you go into the MAGA heartland and it's why the hell are we in this country? Why is my taxpayer dollar funding this war when it should be spent over here?
Then the impact of the war that has affected the whole world post-pandemic, the inflation, the fuel, the energy cost, and everything else has just become associated with something else, become associated with Joe Biden rather than Vladimir Putin, I suppose, to some extent. So I think, the reaction to this conference overnight, in the words of one official that was quoted in Politico this morning, was like, oh, Jesus, what's he doing now? So I think we have to think a bit about how this is going to go, how this is actually going to work as we go forward. So we've got this plan which has been leaked over the weekend for restructuring, I suppose, is the only possible word for Ukraine. It's an American plan which involves about £400 billion worth of GDP coming to America. That basically involves a sort of an economic colonization of Ukraine, that American businesses would be invited in, that the ores, the minerals, the resources will be going out, that America would get first dibs on everything. And it is bigger chunk of GDP than Germany was forced to pay after World War One. It is the kind of reparations that are usually demanded of an aggressor, but to punish them, as was after Japan, as was on Germany. And is this plan, Chris, is it just fantasy? Is it an actionable document? Is it just someone, is it like the back of a beer mat that someone's left lying around and it somehow has got into the pages of a newspaper? Or is this where Trump's thinking is actually headed, that Ukraine is somehow the aggressor and that there is a deal to be made for some real estate guy who, as we just heard, is more concerned that the real estate's been flattened and is now valueless, and that he sees some opportunity to go in and make money out of it?
It is a disgraceful betrayal of the Ukrainians, isn't it? I think what Trump does, I'd like to say that he puts on this front where he sets a high position and meets in the middle, but he doesn't. Invariably, he never gets anything back from it. Look at Mexico, for instance. Mexico are going to pay for this wall. He didn't get a cent from America for that. It's like the tariffs in the US. Sorry for the noise. It's the tariffs in the US about how Canada, Mexico should be paying, Europe should be paying for. Well, the only people who really suffer because of this is the American consumer, the American taxpayer. They do not understand this, but they buy into it. This whole theory that this 500 billion, as you say, is American colonization of Ukraine. He's going to try and do the same in Gaza, and it's all about lining the pockets so Donald Trump can turn around and say he's got a great deal for America and not for the rest of the world.
Yeah. Now, the side effect of Trump doing some of this stuff, which is a bit mad, is that everybody else who are the grown-ups, I suppose, in the room, decide, actually, now we can't rely on America. We are going to have to do some of this stuff ourselves. And that's probably arguably a good thing because, Trump was right when he was saying that NATO nations weren't paying enough for their own defense and that America was being asked to do an awful lot of the heavy lifting. So, Chris Hughes, this suggestion of peacekeeping troops in Ukraine, Starmer and Macron have said they would devote some troops to it. The other European nations have gone, don't really want to do that. But other nations are trying to pay more into NATO and they're trying to find a way around it. But Russia has said that we will never allow NATO troops on that border. And that effectively means, doesn't it, there'll be no European troops and no American troops over near that border. So who would be left to guard a new border wherever it ended up if there's no NATO troops? Surely that comes back down to Russia and Ukraine? It
does. And that comes back to 2014 and what's happened since then and trench warfare. No, it's ridiculous. I've got to be honest. I mean, I thought everyone talks about Starmer having a charisma issue. I thought that was a very decisive, quick, strategically brilliant move by him to say, cards on the table, we're happy to send British troops on a peacekeeping mission into Ukraine, peacekeeping mission. And I think France, it was quite clever because it stole a march on France. So Macron will almost certainly fall into line as well. Whether that's it has to be the very lowest of our ambitions. I mean, we have to do it. But the issue is for the UK that if you remember, we had about 10,000 troops on rotation in Afghanistan, and logistically this was difficult, and we had more troops then. Now, if you're talking about the army, we have about 73,000 available. How many of those, maybe 40,000, would be able to rotate? So if you had, and it'd be a lot more than 10,000. They rotate on a 6-month basis for retraining. So if you imagine a huge brigade of troops of 6,000 or 7,000 people coming back to Britain, retraining, and then the other 3 having to go out there at a different stage. By the time the first lot have done their stint out there, they have to be ready to go back again. This is exhausting. There are vacations. There are people doing other missions. There are something like close to between 15 and 20,000 armed forces personnel from the UK abroad at any one time. I'm talking about the Navy as well. Now, so logistically, it's challenging, but I think the entire thing is extremely challenging for the UK, given the economy, because where are we going to get the resources from? Yes, I think it was a good move by Starmer, and he has said, I think there's a suggestion that we are moving now towards the 2.5% of GDP on defence. It's not enough, a lot of people believe, and Lord Dannatt, the former chief of the army, has already said we don't have enough troops available to do a rotation in Ukraine. That may be true, but maybe something can be done about that. So it would be difficult, but I can't imagine anything other than a NATO style. Now, don't forget that could be without US troops, so it would have to be EU, partially NATO, a new umbrella for a coalition of the willing to do some sort of operation out there, rather similar to the one they did in the Balkans and latterly in Afghanistan. But that logistically and politically, that's going to be a bit of a nightmare to arrange in the meantime.
Yeah, and Putin's going to resist it just as much as possible, isn't he?
Yeah.
Starmer has talked about these troops, but only on the basis there is some kind of what he calls an American backstop, which is a phrase I wish I thought I'd forgotten about after Brexit, but apparently it's back again. So have the American backstop, which is that I suppose, the rule would be that if anyone shoots at the peacekeeping troops, then America's just going to turn up with his big stick and shut everybody up. But Chris Buckton, if you've got a $400 or $500 billion deal, or even 100 billion, even if he gets a chunk of that, he only gets a bit of it, because that's just the opening salvo. Let's say he's got a $100 billion deal in Ukraine for resources, minerals. You've got American businesses there who post-war are trying to restructure, rebuild, make money, all the rest of it. And if Russia were to invade or create kind of a situation which threatens that, I mean, Trump has said he wouldn't send US troops in. But surely if you've got that much money involved, that is exactly what America's going to do, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Americans would expect it as well. If you've got a huge investment in America, such as you say, 100 billion, 500 billion, whatever it is, there'll be protection wanted for those businesses. Now, whether Putin would be so stupid enough to cross that line, that Trump is effectively drawn by putting businesses there. I mean, he talks about red lines all the time, and I think we saw in his first time with Iran, they crossed that red line and nothing was done. He postures a lot, but I can't see how American troops couldn't be sent to the Ukraine to defend their business interests. And certainly Trump would. I think the way he postures himself, he'd need to, wouldn't he? He'd have to send a message back to Putin. This bromance between the two is extremely worrying, though. I think the one benefit is that, does it bring Russia out from the cold in other aspects? I don't know. Yeah, I don't think Trump could expect them to suddenly take over of the Ukraine and its minerals, X, Y, and Z, and not then provide some form of defense to them as well. I mean,
yeah.
The question is, what is Ukraine getting out of the deal?
Exactly. Ukraine is just getting a cessation of the war, aren't they?
Yeah.
But they're not getting their children back. They're not getting to rebuild and restructure. They presumably would not be getting their hands on, as Zelensky has talked about, those frozen Russian assets to rebuild. That would be given back to Russia. you assume, under Trump's agreement and so on. Is there anything Trump can do to force Zelensky to accept this deal? I mean, how is he going to go about doing that? Zelensky, I'm not there, I don't like it, and we're not doing it, and we're not giving up 20% of our land mass to Russia. Thank you very much. What can Trump really do? I mean, I suppose in theory, you've always got the possibilities that he could put his own troops on the ground next to Russians fighting Ukraine, but that's mad. Is he going to do something economic to try and... How can you possibly punish a country at war even more economically?
The only thing effectively he could do is to pull all aid from the Ukraine. Biden was very forward thinking in signing off the recent deal that gave him, I think it was like 34 billion, something like that, before he left office. I won't put it past Trump to throw his toys out the pram and say, right, no more money from us guys, and then it's left to Europe to step up and do more. But as Chris rightly points out, Trump claims credit for America taking the lead on this. It's not American money that's taking the lead, it's European money that's taking, has defended Ukraine more than what America has. So it's interesting. It's a big problem for Europe to see where they would go, whether they're going to step up even further and defend Ukraine. I mean, Zakia, he's made a big thing that we're going to be with you for not just now, not just tomorrow, but for 100 years. So it's down to Europe, really. I mean, what would be the position if all of Europe said, you know what, Donald, we don't need your help. We're going to do this alone, and then see where he stands. It wouldn't look good for Trump if they did that. It would weaken his position, and then he's got a situation with Putin as well.
Yeah. Now, someone who doesn't seem to be using their own name or avatar, but is claiming to be a Crusader Viking, which is sort of something impossible to make because the Vikings weren't Christians, says, so, all right, then put NATO troops into Ukraine. He, I assume you mean Putin here, just might go over the edge by crossing that line. We have no business being in Ukraine. Well, no, nor does Russia, but they seem to be there. Go away. Somebody who doesn't understand Vikings. Bell says, at the end of an election in Ukraine, let's get a ceasefire first. Trump, your ego is something else. Bell, if only he listens to any of us. Chris Hughes, what's Zelensky going to do? Let's just think about how this is going to play out. Trump and Putin come to some kind of deal. Zelensky doesn't like it. It's probably the most likely situation. The US is just going to say, well, in that case, you're on your own, mate. He's still got European funding, which is twice what Americans were. But the Europeans are going to also be going, could you possibly maybe get to a better peace deal than this? Could we find some way out of it? Is he going to be able to afford to ignore Trump's, I'm going to say peace deal, but it's not, but what's he going to do?
Well, that's it. Thanks so much. I don't know. Thanks, Susie. Look, as I said earlier, Zelensky and his advisors and the SBU, the intelligence agency, and all the military and politicians are extremely resourceful. I wouldn't underestimate them. They have, in 3 years, inflicted incredible losses on Russia that Russia predicted would be, in a war that Russia predicted would be over in several days. You can't, that's often been said, but we need to think about that quite a bit because that's incredible. I've watched Ukrainian troops training for the front line, as I've also watched civilians training for the front line, men in their 60s, women in their, in similar age. Ukraine is an incredible country, extremely brave people, most of whom are Europe leaning and NATO leaning and want to be part of NATO. So let's not underestimate them. Zelensky's back against the wall. But again, in those opening salvos of the war, remember how incredibly moving that was when he said on FaceTime, the president's here, the deputy president's here, we're all here and provably there because you could see buildings in Kiev behind them. At that same time, let's go back to what Trump said recently or yesterday about, you started the war or whatever. And let's face it, Kyiv wasn't leveled. There were many attempts by armed sabotage and assassination squads from Putin right in the center of Kiev. There were people died in the presidential complexes defending Zelensky. So Putin's goon squads tried to get to the very heart of Ukraine's government, but they stayed, and they've stayed for 3 years. And I think, so what can they do? They can go on a massive charm offensive across Europe. Zelensky can. People like Bill Browder, who the multimillionaire financier who has done much to oppose Putin through his Magnitsky schemes, are campaigning very, very hard for this 300 billion pounds of Putin / Moscow's money that's been frozen. That would help. He's been doing that for a couple of years, but he had a very good result recently when he spoke to, I think he spoke to 6 or 7 foreign ministers across Europe who all agreed that money should be freed up for Ukraine. The other thing is, this isn't over. I mean, Zelensky, he's in that kind of grey area now where he's trying to regroup and think what's his next move. But they have come up with some amazing suggestions in the past. Let's just remember one of them, which was that if Europe and America keeps helping us, hold back the Russian invasion, we will in the future provide Ukrainian troops, proper battle-hardened troops, to replace American troops in Europe. That was a suggestion at some time. That was very creative, and I'm wondering whether something like that might be appealing to Donald Trump's deal-making, claims. Perhaps Zelensky might make it look like it's Trump's idea. You never know. But I wouldn't underestimate him. It's not all over, I don't think. Let's hope not, because we are. Britain is one of Ukraine's closest allies, and many of us who have been there have sort of fallen for the country. It's an amazing place with amazing people, and I'm going to say the opposite of the people who run the Kremlin.
Yeah, well, we've got this situation, I think, now where we have Donald Trump in office, and I suspect that Zelensky and a lot of people may be thinking, well, look, all you've got to do is do another 3 years.
Yeah,
do another 3 years and he'll be gone. And we've done 3 years. Maybe we can do another 3. It is possible. But we've seen many times in the US, Chris Button, that there's been talk about Trump talking about a 3rd term, which is unconstitutional. I think it's the 22nd Amendment he would need to just totally ignore, like so many of the others he's ignored in the US Constitution. But his big, I suppose, I want a better word, his brain, Steve Bannon, sort of the voice and the brain of the MAGA movement, has been announced, I think, in the US recently, that he's looking into ways, legal arguments for a 3rd term, for overturning that part of the Constitution, for arguing the Constitution is somehow unconstitutional. Yeah. Now, he did say, in the bit I saw, that he can't find a way to prove that yet, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to keep trying. And the last time Trump had to leave the White House by order of the Constitution, he sort of refused to go, and there were riots and people died. Yeah. He's obviously not going to want to, even though he's supposed to go peacefully this time, he's not going to when you get to that point. Do you think that the whole 3rd term and Trump clinging on and this kind of stuff that we've seen with Ukraine, therefore not having a cutoff point, therefore being unending and ineffable, is that a real risk?
I'm personally doubtful about that. I know Bannon speaks about it as much as I think the fact that people overlook is Trump's age by that point as well. It'd be, what would he be now? He's 70.
He's 78, isn't he now? So he'd be.
By the time he finishes, 81. By the time he finishes again, 85. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the electorate would handle another Trump presidency. And I know I understand he won, and he won in a landslide. I think there's many faults with the campaign. Biden pulling out as he did, he has to shoulder an immense amount of responsibility, as does Harris' campaign. I think there is a hardline MAGA supporter who would love him for 12 years effectively. But I just, despite what Bannon says, I can't see it happening. I really can't. But hey, listen, it's America. Anything can happen there. If the last 12 years has taught me anything, it proves that. But God forbid another term of Trump. Jeez.
I think that's probably a good note depend on. It's probably the same phrase that is being uttered in Kyiv, London, Paris, Moscow, God knows where else. No, Moscow is the only place they're happy about it, I suspect. Thank you so much, guys, for your time. We've taken up enough of it this morning, but I think it's been really useful to get some in-depth thought and analysis of exactly the kind that you always do in the paper as well, which people should obviously make an effort to go and hunt out. I do hope that, because I suspect this is not the last time Ukraine and Trump are going to be a big issue. So I do hope you'll come back and do this again at some point, probably like next week, maybe tomorrow, when everything has changed and it's completely radically different again and he's explaining to us. But thank you very much. Thank you everyone for taking part. We'll be back again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. Until then, everybody, stay safe, take care, don't invade anywhere. Tatty bye.